In 2015, jihadist extremists shattered Europe's self-image as a haven of tolerance, freedom, and religious diversity. Intolerance, armed and ready to kill, is at war with European values.
They're literally telling people on their phones, go and kill, go and kill.
Across Europe, the level of threat is higher than ever before.
6 attempts at terrorism in this country just in the last 12 months.
Alongside jihadism, the extreme right is gaining popularity throughout Europe. Anti-immigration and anti-minority sentiment is on the rise.
Islamist extremists need right-wing extremists. They thrive off of one another.
In this film, we document the crisis facing Europe.
Hitler was right!
If this Nazi gang would have power today, you all would end in a concentration camp.
We retrace the traumatic events of a dark year.
Fire on the cafe this afternoon.
There is now a choice to be made. How far will Europe tolerate intolerance? The year began and ended with atrocities in Paris, which horrified the world. In early January, 2 attacks stunned the French capital. The Kouachi brothers stormed into the offices of the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine and killed 12 people. 2 days later, a third terrorist stormed into a kosher supermarket, taking hostages and murdering 4. I met one of the supermarket hostages, Alain Coanon, a retired diplomat.
Ask everybody, who are you, name, age, job, and origin.
Amadi Koulibaly was radicalized by Islamic fundamentalists in France. He pledged allegiance to Islamic State and shot dead customers who were shopping for Shabbat.
There, lying down, was a corpse with blood around, one of the victims of Koulibaly. They were killed only because they are Jews or Christian, as me. Only that. It's the crime of being born different.
On the 11th of January, 4 million people took to the streets of France, along with 40 world leaders standing arm in arm, to show solidarity with the victims and defiance of terror. The attacks touched the whole of France and the heart of the Republic.
Sans les Juifs de France, la France ne serait plus la France. Et ce message, c'est à nous tous de le clamer haut et fort. Quand on s'attaque aux Juifs de France, on s'attaque à la France et on s'attaque à la conscience universelle. Ne l'oublions jamais.
The Jewish community in France has long felt a growing sense of unease and threat. 2015's events didn't come out of the blue. Violent attacks against the Jewish community have been on the rise for years. Feeling increasingly vulnerable, Europe's Jews have begun to consider their future, especially in France. In 2015, over 8,000 Jews left France for Israel. Take David and Judith Benichou, for example. They have decided to quit France.
Ce qui apparaissait comme une affaire islamo-juive avec cette montée en puissance de l'antisémitisme islamique, entre guillemets, aujourd'hui, d'une certaine manière, c'est un phénomène qui va bien au-delà de la question juive, qui attaque les fondamentaux de la République, de la démocratie, de la liberté d'expression.
France has traditionally been very behind in that. It hasn't addressed identity issues, integration issues, racism. It hasn't looked at the ideologies and tried to counter those.
The French minister Harlem Désir started his political career on the streets of Paris campaigning against racism. Why have 30 years of your words against hatred, against racism, why have they failed to persuade France?
Racism is still here, discrimination, obviously, and anti-Semitism is even perhaps more aggressive and with new forms. There is a kind of new aspect of it linked with an exploitation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, using internet and the social network to propagate the hatred against Jewish people without risking to be stopped by the law.
Many of the recent attacks on the Jewish community have been deadly. In May 2014, French national Mohamed Nemouche shot dead 3 visitors and a staff member at the Jewish Museum in Brussels. 2 years earlier, French-born Mohamed Merah murdered 3 soldiers and then attacked the Ozar HaTorah Jewish school, killing 3 children and a teacher. At the time, these were treated as isolated incidents.
We had a kind of new radicalization in our own countries, which was probably underestimated.
Back in January 2015, alarm bells were ringing. On the 70th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust, a special conference in Prague was held to discuss the alarming rise in anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and hate crimes.
We are all in the same European boat. It is getting through the growing waves of radical Islam, neo-Nazism, and anti-Semitism.
This Prague conference on extremism came just days after those January Paris attacks.
Is anti-Semitism, as you see it, on the rise in a very dangerous, alarming way in a country like yours?
Anti-Semitism is on the rise. The Jews are attacked on 2 fronts, jihadism on one side and the old French anti-Semitism, and they make a sort of double bind. But there is a big difference between today and the 30s, is that the state, the republic, the elite are not corrupted by the venom, by the poison of anti-Semitism. And this is huge.
What is a greater value to be protected? Jews wearing kippot who are murdered because they're Jews in Toulouse, or racist, bigoted journalists who are murdered because of their pen? And I just ask you to ask yourself the question, if the only murders had been the 4 Jews in the kosher supermarket, would there have been a demonstration? Absolutely not. France is the capital of hypocrisy.
You know, everybody are thinking about anti-Semitism as a disease of the Jews. It's nothing to do with Jews, it's a disease of the society. And often, very often, society doesn't understand how dangerous is anti-Semitism for itself. It means the society, in general, is infected by radicalism. And tomorrow we'll have more and more non-Jewish targets attacked. This is the experience already, unfortunately, of 2015.
Denmark is in shock following the deadly attacks that led to...
The gunman opened fire on the cafe this afternoon during a free speech event. One man attending the event was killed, 3 police officers.
A mere month after January's Paris attacks, jihadist terror claimed 2 more victims, this time in Copenhagen. The first was killed at a cultural center hosting an event entitled Art, Blasphemy, and Freedom of Expression. The other was a Jewish security guard on duty at a bat mitzvah celebration.
It's a very, very difficult situation for European Jews, given the importance that the jihadis place upon attacking Jews, along with police, along with government.
Majid Nawaz is a British-born former member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, an outlawed anti-Semitic Islamist group. Today, he runs a counter-extremism think tank.
What was the attraction? What made you, quote unquote, a young extremist?
What happened was I came across a recruiter who was able to provide for me a sense of belonging in an organization that I wasn't finding from mainstream society. And that's effectively what happens to anyone who joins whether a far-right extremist organization or an Islamist organization. If you look at the profiles of a lot of the people that have committed successful attacks, they've had flirtations with the wrong side of the law prior to this. So it went from the university pseudo-intellectualism that us lot kind of joined in the 90s to the thuggery that is ISIS now.
The jihadists use social media to encourage violent individuals to commit acts of murder in their home countries.
ISIS literally sit in Syria or Iraq, tell people in France, in Belgium, in Britain, no, don't come to Syria anymore. You can do more damage where you are. They're literally telling people on their phones, go and kill, go and kill.
Through video propaganda, the extremist jihadists also attract young men and women to join the Islamic State.
Al-Qaeda and ISIS want that civil war between Muslim and non-Muslim Europeans, because it's only from such division can fascism thrive.
It strikes me that politicians for more than a decade have been making big speeches about the dangers of extremism.
I don't think enough has been done in demonstrating intolerance, our intolerance, state intolerance towards intolerance itself, particularly Islamist extremism.
Killer Zelfadine Rezji has just entered the hotel.
Dozens were killed, reportedly including British, Belgian, and German tourists.
Even Europeans on holiday are not safe. In June, an Islamist extremist launched an attack on a beach in Sousse, Tunisia. But Islamist extremists aren't the only ones threatening European values. Far-right extreme nationalist groups and political parties have been gaining ground across Europe in recent years. Their focus? Anti-minority and anti-immigrant sentiment. Among the most extreme, these members of Golden Dawn in Greece. Unashamed European neo-fascists.
Είναι πρωτόγονοι, είναι μοιάσματα, είναι υπάνθρωποι, δεν μας ενδιαφέρει καθόλου η ύπαρξή τους. Γιατί είμαστε έτοιμοι να ανοίξουμε τους φούρνους. Σαπούνια γιατί είναι και ωραίο, ξέρεις, όχι για ανθρώπους, γιατί είναι χημικοί αυτοί, μπορεί να πάθουμε να βγάλουμε κανένα καντήλα, κανένα τέτοιο, θα τα έχουμε σαπούνια για τα...
Right-wing extremism has been deemed a second-tier threat in many ways to Islamist extremism. It needs to be pushed up the list of priorities.
Across Europe, nationalist parties are winning votes and political influence. There's a spectrum from populist anti-immigration parties to an extreme fringe which openly embraces neo-Nazi symbolism. Far-right political parties now hold 10% of the seats in the European Parliament. In Hungary, the Jobbik party is a potent political force with 20% of the vote in the last election. This is their annual celebration in Budapest's Central Park. They have paramilitary and uniformed branches. Individuals associated with Jobbik have been convicted of violent attacks on Roma. Their leaders have used anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and xenophobic language, and yet they have entered mainstream Hungarian politics. Their message appears to have a populist appeal.
The issue with dealing with white supremacist movements is actually their ideology is not always strongly formed. It's not always something that one rationally understands the intricacies of. It's an ideology that is based on fear, it's based on fear of change, and they use that fear to mobilize.
Back in Prague, speakers from 30 countries met to draft and sign a declaration against hate speech designed to specifically define and criminalize anti-Semitism, racism, and attempts to limit freedom of worship in Europe. But where do the boundaries lie when it comes to legislating against hate speech?
If you say seriously, openly, on the soapbox, that all gypsies are thieves, If you say what Goebbels and Hitler said about the Jews, stereotypically, if you say also that all Muslims are terrorists, that should be unlawful. That is a case of acting offensively against a particular group in a libelous fashion, and it should not be permitted. You do not have to be tolerant towards the intolerant, because it's liberty now or tyranny later.
There's more and more ignorance about what anti-Semitism is. I think Europe could be clearer and more explicit about embracing a definition of anti-Semitism which really described the problem. So it's not enough that everybody says they're against anti-Semitism. They have to show that they understand what anti-Semitism is.
Each European country interprets anti-racism laws differently. A European directive which encourages states to criminalise hate crimes and hate speech is being ignored in 14 member states.
The 2008 Common Framework Directive of the European Union, which requires European states to criminalise incitement to hatred and Holocaust denial, yet we know that states are just not applying
Well, that's
the
a
laws.
good point. The problem is there's no political will to actually implement it. So Vera, speaking for the Commission, address that.
We are monitoring the situation in 14 member states. The framework decision regarding combating racism and xenophobia was not implemented fully. I am very much urging them to do it, including Holocaust denial sanction against this, because not in all the countries this has been implemented.
So there is a fundamental problem of political will.
So this is running now, yes.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, I am... It's my task to do it, and I am now declaring here, I am doing it.
My experience of anti-Semitism is that people have this focus on the evil of Israel, and they propose boycotts. They propose to punish Israel, but no one else on the planet. They propose, for example, in academia, to make sure that Israelis don't come to our campuses and don't take part in the global community of scholarly work.
Even with hate speech laws nominally in place, the internet is spreading poisonous ideas quicker than ever before. It's direct, personal, and anonymous, a perfect tool for the peddlers of hatred.
You'll see a lot of terms using Muslim paedophile, Muslim groomer, don't take your children around Muslim communities, which are promoted through graphics, online graphics, stories, blogs around Muslim communities. Pretty much far-right groups jumping on that to create fear and to create apprehension within our society.
So here's a challenge for the media, who need specialists to scrutinise this toxic ocean of hate speech.
I've certainly seen figures that suggest that when there's that eruption in the news, so for example, the Gaza crisis being in the news, two things happen. There is an upsurge in online expressions, many of which cross that line into hate speech, and there is an upsurge in online harassment and physical violence directed at Jewish buildings and sometimes Jewish people. And the same must be true, and in fact I've seen the figures that suggest it is true, for anti-Muslim attacks. And we have a team of moderators. Their sole job is weeding out anything which violates our standards, community standards, and constitutes hate speech. And the sad truth is, there's a lot of it.
The media have a responsibility not to conflate extremists and intolerant individuals with whole communities.
You're talking about a narrow, small group, not the whole large community. It's really important to do that, and the media are crucial in that, because if they don't do it, suddenly these words just enter the national conversation and become easy to say, it's all Muslims, it's all Jews, it's all whichever minority is involved.
Thousands of migrants have given up on the idea of leaving Hungary by train.
500,000 asylum applications have been made in Europe so far this year.
By summertime 2015, the largest population displacement since World War II was posing a profound new challenge to Europe's values of openness, free movement, and tolerance. As some countries fenced off their borders, others opened their arms to the migrants. Germany offered a haven to 1 million refugees.
Wenn Europa in der Flüchtlingsfrage versagt, dann ginge ein entscheidender Gründungsimpuls eines geeinten Europas verloren. nämlich die enge Verbindung mit den universellen Menschenrechten, die Europa von Anfang an bestimmt hat und die auch weiter gelten muss. Dafür werden wir gemeinsam kämpfen, meine Damen und Herren.
As Jewish people, we are the first to know what it's like to be on the move, to be fleeing from danger, to be crying out for a home. And we need to reach out to these people now and to assist them.
The large number of Muslim refugees from Syria and neighbouring countries has seen a sharp rise in attacks targeting Europe's Muslim populations. Sweden has taken the highest number of migrants per capita and has seen attacks on asylum centres.
The question is going to be whether governments and communities can equip places that are not used to receiving people that are different, ethnic minorities, and in particular in places which have never before had such community change.
The masked swordsman who stabbed 2 people to death at a school in Sweden.
An attacker walked into a Swedish school where more than 90% of students come from migrant families. Wearing a mask and armed with a sword, Anton Lundin Pettersson picked both his victims according to their ethnicity. In October, the rise of hate speech and related violent attacks, both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim, prompted the European Commission in Brussels to tackle it head-on at the annual Fundamental Rights Colloquium.
I think it is highly symbolic that we have decided to devote this first colloquium to anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. Europe is going through a period of turmoil and crisis which is challenging the very values on which it was built. It is challenging the very fabric of European society and therefore the very fabric of European cooperation.
We must accept international definition of anti-Semitism, ensuring that the limits of hate will be clearly defined. We should toughen law enforcement and introduce criminal liability for anti-Semitic propaganda, including on the internet and in social networks.
I will have 2 people in my services whose task it will be, one, to make sure that the issue of anti-Semitism is her or his main activity, and the other, Islamophobia, and that they report to me directly so that I know what I need to do when there is an issue at hand.
A series of gun and bomb attacks in Paris has killed at least 100.
Terroristes d'une ampleur sans précédent sont en cours dans l'agglomération parisienne.
In November, Europe's Islamist extremists struck their most devastating blow in Paris once again. On the evening of the 13th of November 2015, 130 were killed in a series of coordinated terrorist attacks. 3 suicide bombers struck near the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, followed by suicide bombings and mass shootings at cafes, restaurants, and a music venue. 89 people were killed at the Bataclan Theatre.
Now, many people have said, oh my goodness, now everybody's a target. I think that was an error. I think that once the Jews and the satirists were targeted, everyone was already a target. Democratic politics was a target, freedom of speech was a target, and the Republic was a target.
The Paris attacks shook Europe out of any residual complacency. Brussels endured days of lockdown as the terror cell behind the attacks was uncovered. From Paris to Moscow to Washington, there is now a common rhetorical commitment to confronting violent extremism.
It is clear for France, for Russia, for the United States that it should be a coalition, political coalition, and a lot of very active undertakings, including political undertakings and military undertakings, should be done. But it's not enough. We should have long-term programs.
This bleak year, 2015, ended as it began.
A historian looks at the European system of today and says it's robust, it's beautiful, it's quite protective, but it's vulnerable because Europeans of today are not better people than Europeans in the 1930s.
On ne peut pas imaginer que c'est juste un long fleuve tranquille et que c'est une espèce de cheminement naturel vers Israël. Non, il y a un moment de rupture.
As a Jew,
We have a responsibility to ensure that the community can go about its business and feel confident in living in our society. Because if we can't live as a free person, then we have to think very seriously where the future lies.
Extremism breeds extremism. It's a feedback cycle which Europe needs to break.
The way to do it is to stand out there very vocally, all of us together, to say no to far-right extremism and no to Islamist extremism. But crucial in that solidarity platform, there must be Muslim voices to be so visible and vocal against this scourge of ideology, so that the mainstream is constantly saying to the far right, you're wrong, not all Muslims agree with this. Look, you know, we can see them out there publicly challenging it.
This kind of issue of integration and tackling extremism is a long-term 10 to 20 year, if not more, issue.
You need, of course, the instrument of the state, of the law, of the repression sometimes, but you also need the mobilization of the citizen. It's a battle. It's not lost.
What we see today, still it is a conventional terrorism. Tomorrow I see the strong synergy between two things, between nuclear proliferation and international terrorism. And that's why the only one way how to oppose future nuclear terrorism, chemical terrorism, biological terrorism is a full coalition of all 5 nuclear superpowers. This is what we demand today.
Post-1945 Europe was built on tolerance, diversity, and inclusion. In 2015, these principles were profoundly challenged, and there's a real danger of revisiting the darkest corners of this continent's past.
It is upon us to fight the return of past demons, demons we believed banned forever, the demons of the antisemitism and the ultra-nationalism, the demons of fanaticism and intolerance. We must fight these demons every step of the way, today and every day.
Failure to unite against extremism, hate speech, and intolerance threatens to undermine the future of Europe.